We talked last time about how Moshe doesn't just go to Paro and say, Shlach et ami, let my people go. That Hashem is not just saying to Paro, let my people go. Or at least repeatedly, when that phrase occurs, it is often the full phrase, Shlach et ami v'ya'avduni bamidbar. Hashem wants his people not just to go free, but to go free so that they can serve him in the wilderness. And we learn that serving him in the wilderness is not just about accomplishing an arbitrary set of mitzvot, but it includes the need for the livestock that Moshe insists on bringing out of Mitzrayim so that they can perform sacrifices. What that necessarily injects into any discussion about freedom and freedom from political oppression and what the value of that freedom is when we're talking about a Judaic context is that in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, freedom is not just a thing you desire for its own sake and so you can do whatever you want with it. What he wants Am Yisrael to do with freedom is to use it to apply their sincere motivation to fulfill his mitzvot and keep his Torah and do so more successfully because they're more free to do that. And so if we're trying to read that into the present day context, it is interesting to ask whether it is the case that everyone who says that they're just trying to fight for the most freedom possible is equally motivated to use that freedom for a worthwhile purpose. And that's a salient point because really on both sides of the argument going on in the present day in Israel over the reforms of the Supreme Court and all of that, there are people who are talking about the need for freedom and they're fighting for more freedom. But I wouldn't say it's equally the case that everyone claims they want to use that freedom for the same purpose. So you have people saying, oh, well, they're afraid that the Knesset and the government governing coalition might be oppressive if the Supreme Court's power is limited, or is even delimited, because currently it's not. And yet I think in that cohort, you don't really often hear the claim that that's because it's so important that they have the freedom that they want to have protected by the court because they're going to try to use it to keep the Torah better. Maybe you'd find that here and there, but that doesn't seem to be the main thrust of the argument. And that is notable because on the other side of the argument, you have people who say that the court sometimes is getting in the way of their freedom, but it is more frequently the case that what they want is the freedom to keep the Torah in a Jewish state. Right? And so there are a whole host of issues that you could identify that have to do with that. Obviously, a real hot button one is the settlement of the land of Israel. The Supreme Court has allowed the government in the past to destroy the homes of Jews and take them forcibly from their homes, and chose not to protect the rights of those citizens of the state of Israel, because basically the program being implemented aligned with the court's politics in a way that made the members of the court deciding the case indifferent to the rights of the people involved. And that I think is, one example among many where I think it's fair to argue that those proposing the reforms of the court maybe are more frequently concerned that the court in its current configuration is more likely to cast itself in the role of Paro than the Knesset, or at least the equally likely, let's say. Because obviously the Knesset in its time and in its day has played plenty of that role as well. And indeed, in for example, the withdrawal from Gaza, where there was this aforementioned destruction of property and disregarding of rights of citizens of the state and all of that, That was something that came from within the Knesset, and the court simply signed off on it. But I think what you see in that example there is an instance where whether you're talking about the Knesset or you're talking about the court, you can have concentrations of political power that are pitted against the desire that Jews have to be free enough to fulfill the mitzvot that they think Hashem wants them to fulfill. And the argument on the other side isn't really in any sincere way being made like, no, you're going to be able to keep the Torah better this way. It's just, no, we decided we want to do this because of other standards and other reasons. Really, it's pleasing to other gods, so to speak. So I think putting that frame on it, it's interesting to look more closely at this event of Yetziat Mitzrayim and the sort of the final triggering event of Makat Bechorot, when Moshe insists on taking the livestock so that they can serve Hashem, and Paro says no, and then there's this striking of the firstborn in Egypt, and the Israelites are spared the striking of the firstborn because of a particular set of mitzvot that they accomplish, which is a special Korban Pesach carried out in Mitzrayim. So just to read from these psukim, so I think rather than reading everything, I'll talk in broad strokes about all of it, and then we can read some specific psukim. So we know it's a sacrifice of a lamb, of a sheep or a goat, and what Bnei Israel at the time were instructed to do was to slaughter the lamb and roast it, not boil it, but they had to roast it over the fire. And it says, "Ulakhu min hadam natnu al shtei hamezuzot wa al hamashkof al habatim asher yochlu oto bahem." So they should take the blood and strike it on the two sides of the doorposts and the upper posts of the houses in which they shall eat it. ואכלו את הבשר בלילה הזה, צלי אש ומצות, על המרורים יאכלוהו. And they shall eat the meat in the night, the roasted with fire, and unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. And other details of what parts you should eat and how you should prepare it, and how you have to burn it up. But then, v'chacha tochlu oto. מפניכם חגורים, נעליכם ורגליכם, ומקלכם בידכם, ואכלתם אותו בחיפזון פסח הוא לאדוני. And thus you shall eat it, with your loins girded, and your shoes on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Pesach. And then it goes on to describe how there's going to be Makat Bechorot, and Hashem will pass over the houses of the Ivrim, because they are of Bnei Israel, because they are keeping these mitzvot. So a number of details there are the same when we now are expected to accomplish Korban Pesach on Har Bayit, in the Mikdash, and Yerushalayim. But there are some things here that obviously are specific to Mitzrayim, like the painting of the blood on the doorpost, and we learn elsewhere that this is done with ezov. In what I just read, it just says we're, putting it on the doorpost. We're taking the blood and putting it on the doorpost. But ezov is a plant that we're told in an adjacent verse, "Lakachtem agudat ezov utavaltem badam asher basaf v'higa'atem el hamashkof ואל שתי המזוזות מן הדם, אשר בסף, ואתם לא תצאו איש מפתח ביתו עד הבוקר." So now you're going to take the ezov, you're going to dip it in the blood, you're going to use that to sort of paint it on the doorposts, and then you stay in the house. So when we're doing Korban Pesach in the present day, or soon, B'ezrat Hashem, we're not doing these things with the doorposts and putting the blood on the doorposts using hyssop or ezov. And also the stuff about here's how you should eat it. You should have your staff and your belt and your shoes, behepazon, in haste. That all seems to be specific to Mitzrayim as well. And the question is, what is all that doing there? Like, is this just a curiosity of sort of quote unquote historical record where there was this mitzvah at this particular time and in this particular place, but we don't do that anymore. We don't have to worry about it from a halachic standpoint. And so it's just a curiosity. Don't stress about it too much, because you're not going to have to comply with these instructions. So there's no sort of halachic manual published by a great Acharon about exactly how to put the blood on your doorposts, because we don't do that now. So then what's it for? Why? And of course, there are many comments and many interesting interpretations you can give. I think today, to me, the interesting thing is to think of it in as partly an opportunity to, by analogy, comment on the present political situation a little bit. Because again, what we said is that this situation arguably could be construed to be about a situation where there are Israelites, so to speak, who feel that the current structure of power under which they are living doesn't make them free to fulfill Hashem's commands. And that, I think you would, if you, so to speak, it's not even an issue, so to speak. I think Aaron Barak, the former president of the Supreme Court, is basically on record saying this, but the court's role is not to ensure the fullest fulfillment of the Torah. Its standards and its goals are set by other measures, and sometimes that makes room for Jews to flourish to a certain degree in the Jewish state, but it does also set guardrails and boundaries. And the point is that it's very conceivable to the Supreme Court in its current configuration to say, you want to keep the Torah, but if the Torah carries you over this line, then it's our job to stop you, because actually the whole conception of how the state is supposed to be run is not to let Torah and the command of HaKadosh Baruch Hu trump everything else, but to allow it to operate within boundaries that are defined by other needs and constraints. It's the court's duty to protect and to impose on the rest of what happens in the society. So if we can accept that that's the view of the Supreme Court, and then in turn, there are cases where you have citizens of the state, Jews, who are trying to keep the Torah, doing, for example, things like trying to settle the land, and sometimes the government ends up trying to stop them. And the court backs that up and it ensures that no one would be able to argue that somehow the rights of these citizens to keep the Torah should be protected or upheld. Then we're starting to see this situation as one where maybe you can say, okay, so this is an analogous situation to what we had in Mitzrayim, to the degree that we have a structure of political power that's saying to Hashem's people, you can't keep the Torah fully, and I'm going to stop you. And so Hashem is saying, Shlach et ami v'yavduni, set forth my people so they can serve me. The political structure is saying no, and they come to loggerheads. And now the question is, how does that get resolved? And I think now we're going to be very much operating in the space of analogy, but there are a few elements specifically of this Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim that I think are very interesting with regard to this, because it's partly a question about how long things take and how to accomplish the goal. Like, if the goal of people who want to be able to keep the Torah in its fullness and not to have the government of the state of Israel explicitly stand in the way of that sometimes, then the question is, how do you sort of build a movement to make that happen in a way that's going to be successful? Because what we're seeing in the present day basically is like having enough votes to do it by a democratic process, seemingly not enough, because actually there's a whole lot of strife being produced right now that's deriving from disagreement about whether that kind of freedom should be granted to the portion of the country's citizens who want the government to give a wide berth to the fulfillment of Torah by the people who have an interest in keeping it. And what I note about these mitzvot specific to Yetziat Mitzrayim, of Korban Pesach, is that it's kind of in a way, it can be read as a roadmap for a kind of, let's say, political demonstration, but of a very different kind than what we've been seeing recently. The demonstrations we've been seeing recently have been very much about going out into public spaces and being disruptive and being very visible as an active mob concentrating together in the centers of cities and things like that. And that can sometimes be an appropriate thing. There's no reason to focus on or comment on that aspect now. But in another sense, Korban Pesach and Mitzrayim was a different kind of demonstration. Why is that? Well, we said previously, and this is supported by many sources in the Torah, that slaughtering sheep in Mitzrayim was in itself a form of blasphemy, essentially, against the gods of Mitzrayim. This is the case because it was a to'ava, a sort of an abomination to the Mitzrayim to eat with shepherds, even in the time of Yosef, and where Moshe says, well, but if we start slaughtering sheep, then the Mitzrayim are going to stone us, right? There's this understanding that everyone has that you just can't go around slaughtering sheep in the midst of the Mitzrayim because this is unacceptable to them. It's somehow directly spitting in the eye of their gods, of their idols. And yet this is what Bnei Yisrael are being asked to do. So there's something kind of risky about what they're doing. And then they're not just doing it somewhere, in a subterranean cave where no one can hear about it. It's dafka, you have to take the blood of the lamb and smear it on your door. In other words, that you're taking your home and you're turning your home into a giant political lawn sign, so to speak, saying, look, I am rejecting these false gods and I'm defiling them or I'm blaspheming against them. And I'm doing it in a public way, but not by going out and doing it in the public square or having a whole mob come and do it in the public square, but by taking my home, my dwelling, and turning that into a physically rooted and sort of stationary billboard for political and religious dissidents. Not only that, but then there's this element of the ezov and the lamb and the sort of the belt and the staff and the shoes and all these things that we have to explain. So what is the lamb about? I think there's a lot of things you could ask, and we've talked about some of them before in other shiurim about like why the Mitzrayim were so concerned about sheep and what that might mean. I think for today, maybe we can just say that a lamb represents some amount of, let's say, focus on the financial short term and assuming a certain kind of risk of loss of long-term benefits, right? Because what is a lamb if you don't slaughter it? It's an animal that will grow up to be a sheep, and from the sheep you'll get milk and you'll get wool. So it has all of this value that it can deliver to you over time if you don't slaughter it. If you slaughter it today, you can have a nice meal and then you're done and you don't have a lamb anymore. So there's something that let's say, people who are more risk averse and they're thinking about how with stability and with not rocking the boat, not taking risks, you're going to eventually be able to get a whole lot of wool out of that. So let's just try to keep things on an even keel and not do anything to ruffle anyone's feathers. That's the thing that we're not doing today. Today, what we're doing is we're, taking a certain kind of risk, and doing it with our household, doing it household by household, but as a nation or as a coalition of people with certain commitments, and doing it in a way that invites, in a sense, the wrath of the priests of the false gods, that are wielding this oppressive power. So that's another element that's there. And then I think with the Azov, what we know about Azov from Tanakh is just this one statement in the time of Shlomo HaMelech, that Shlomo was very wise and he knew about plants and animals, and what he knew about Azov was it was Asher Yotze Bakir, that it grows out of a wall. And as I was trying to argue and talking about the Shamir, which is another maybe kind of concept of plants breaking through rock, and the Azov has very much an analogous kind of quality to it, which you can argue for other reasons. It's this plant that grows out of a wall. It's the idea that the slow progression of life and development, like of a plant with a seed and some roots in the crevice of a rock, that can eventually just grow through a wall, even though the wall would not allow someone to pass if they took a run at it and sort of started to kick and punch at it. So walls are seemingly impassable on a short time scale, but for Azov, on a long time scale, you can just grow right through it. And the wall starts to crumble and fall down, and you're still a living thing and you win. So there's also this element of maybe with the passage of time, things look different. And I think that the last element, this idea of bechipazon, it's sort of, on the other hand, is the opposite concept, which is that sometimes the time is now, right? Like it does sometimes come to a head, and then you need to sort of push with all your might to sort of get that last rock in the wall to sort of fall out, and then you have like a place to walk through. So there's this paradox where on the one hand, a lot of times we're waiting for things to happen, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu works in his ways, and he kind of decides whether this is really a thing that takes a year or a decade or a century, and doesn't tell you in advance how long you have to wait in faith and, with emunah, and try to do what you can while feeling like you're still facing an impossible challenge. But then it reaches the point where it's like, wow, this rock is loose because of all the azov that's been growing there for 100 years or whatever. And now we really need to push. And so you need to be kind of with your staff and your belt and your shoes with the idea of like, you need to be ready to go, because maybe it's going to be katzot halayla, maybe it's going to be, that moment where suddenly it happens. And at that point, Moshe says, all right, we're going. And then you go. And you need to be prepared for suddenly having to go to significant effort and really try to make a difference in a much shorter period of time. And when you do, I think that what accompanies that is the matzot and the maror, the sort of half-baked bread and the bitter herbs, that there's a certain amount of bitterness and incompleteness to the bread that you're going to be eating, that there's kind of an acceptance that when you're pushing for things to happen more rapidly, that there's something a little bit hackneyed or a little bit less than perfectly seasoned about the meal that you're going to produce, but you accept that and you embrace it as part of the need of being able to sort of act b'chipazon, with haste in the moment when the moment presents itself. And so I think when you wrap all of these different concepts together, So the question is now, what does it have to do with the striking of the firstborn? What does that mean? And how does that now relate back to other things that we were talking about? So I think, and this is again something that's come up in other shiurim, obviously you can talk about the firstborn like it's the first issue of the womb of a woman, and we're really talking about like sons who are born to women who are having their first child, and there's no other sort of biological thing that this could mean. But firstborn also in a historical sense at the level of nations, or in uh, a sense of thinking in terms more like about generations of people, the firstborn is just kind of people who came earlier on and maybe are therefore more in power and more in charge. And I think that's interesting, to think about in terms of political change, because clearly here in Israel, what we have right now in the case of the Supreme Court, this old guard of elites who represent the culture of the original founders of the modern state of Israel, who were very European for the most part, very secular for the most part, and had a kind of Western style and enlightened and let's say sort of modern and European liberal kind of notion of what their Zionism was. And that used to be the reigning ideology for not just the Supreme Court, but for the Labor Party that controlled the Knesset. I mean, the whole system was kind of designed to have one party rule and just be a socialist utopia with Jewish characteristics forever. And that didn't happen because that wasn't actually a successful idea. Baruch Hashem, the country has become something different that I think is much better, and that you can argue for that betterness by standards of Torah that are pretty clear. But the Supreme Court is kind of a time capsule of that because it appoints itself, which is one of the issues that's been brought up in these questions of the reforms. So the Supreme Court appoints itself, and it can maintain the hold on power for an elite whose ideological hold on the country as a whole, and whose hold on the reins of other organs of power in the state, has been just sort of slipping away through the democratic process, through demography, through the passage of time, and really through the winding down of the ideological project of secular labor Zionism, which has not really been able to sustain itself because of its failings and limitations. But the Supreme Court has been this sort of last bastion of it, where it can keep its ideology pure, because the rules have been set up in such a way that you only need to be able to find a half dozen people in the country who still think this way, and you can just make them all Supreme Court judges. So we're talking about a kind of a firstborn. And, when I'm talking now in those terms, and we're talking about the striking of the firstborn, chas v'chalila, that should be construed, that I'm meaning this in any way other than the metaphorical one, meaning like it's like Kadosh Baruch Hu and the passage of time that are dealing with firstborns when we're talking in these terms. The dinosaurs were the firstborn. We've said that in another shiur. Mitzrayim was the firstborn nation as a whole. They were the great empire that ruled the ancient world. So we're really talking to some degree about just the idea that as time passes, people who once were in charge eventually end up not in charge anymore, just because the society as a whole evolves and changes and slips away from them, unless they can stay in touch with who the people they're ruling are. And that is clearly what's at issue here. So I think when you wrap all these different comparisons and analogies together, what it points to is, I think we are in some ways facing a situation where there is kind of a firstborn rule. The way I'd put it is, Israel is partly an oligarchy ruled by a kind of firstborn class, or a firstborn elite, and that oligarchical rule is accomplished through the Supreme Court with its current structure. And that is the point at issue, and what people have been arguing about whether it should be changed. And I don't know that this means that it can be decisively changed now. And if this is the moment of, where you can put shoulder to yoke and sort of push, or, and the chipazon, you can finally get the wall to crumble down, or whether this is still a moment where you have to say, okay, let's not be hastily messianic about our insistence that we have to fix everything right now, because maybe actually the society is less ready for it than it seemed. Like, it isn't just enough to get 51% of some vote and then make whatever changes you want. If too much of the society can't come along with it, time will change what the situation is with that regard. But I think it could be both, and I'm not sure that I can say for certain which kind of moment we're in. Maybe it's in some sense both the case that certain kinds of pushing are needed right now, and also the case that one has to have measured expectations of what that can accomplish. But the operative point in all of this, I think, is going back to the doorposts, because what it's saying is that if you're trying to bring about this change, where ultimately the firstborn is the firstborn that represents the oppression and the sort of barrier standing between the Bnei Yisrael who want to keep the Torah and their opportunity to do that, the freedom that will allow them to do that. That when you have a situation like this, the way that you prepare to survive the overthrowing of that firstborn rule and to be granted freedom that you're seeking, because that the passage of time and the sort of the Ezov working its way through the wall doesn't cause you to sort of as rapidly decline and fade away in the same way that the firstborn does, then what you do to identify yourself as different from them and to insist on bringing about that kind of change is you make your home a kind of banner for the blasphemy against the false gods that the firstborn represents, that will set you apart and will show HaKadosh Baruch Hu that this is your intention, but it will also show everyone around you, including your confederates, including your it will show everyone around you, including the people who are trying to accomplish the same change, that you've taken something precious to you, which represents who you are and where you live, your home, and you've turned it into a beacon for demonstrating your commitment to Hashem, even when it pits you against the powers that be and causes you to take risks because you're blaspheming against their false gods and insisting on doing so when HaKadosh Baruch Hu's commands require it of you. So that's easier said than done, and I'm not sure this means everyone needs to be hanging his up on their doorpost right now, or whether there's some better ways people could think of to ruffle some feathers along lines that the Torah prescribes. But if that gets done enough by enough people with the right intention, then whether it will happen soon because the wall is close to falling down, or whether it will take some time, I think the Torah is showing us the way to how to bring about a transition to a greater degree of freedom to serve Hashem according to His Torah.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.